Sarah stood at the bay window of her countryside mansion, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of amber and crimson. The sprawling estate that had once felt like a dream come true now seemed more like a gilded cage. Her perfectly manicured fingers traced patterns on the cold glass as she observed James's black Mercedes pulling into their circular driveway 3 hours later than he'd promised to return. Another late meeting, she whispered to herself, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. The James she'd married 5 years ago would have called, would have apologized, would have brought home her favorite lilies as a peace offering. But this James, this stranger wearing her husband's face, barely seemed to notice her existence anymore. The mansion's isolation, nestled among rolling hills and dense forests, had initially appealed to their desire for privacy. Now, it only amplified the growing distance between them. Their nearest neighbors were miles away, and the staff departed promptly at 6 every evening, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts and suspicions. As James's footsteps echoed through the marble foyer, Sarah noticed something different in his gait, a slight hesitation, a carefulness that seemed out of place. She turned, composing her features into the pleasant mask she'd perfected over the past few months. "Welcome home, darling," she called out, her voice carrying the perfect note of warmth. "Dinner's keeping warm in the oven." James appeared in the doorway, his tailored suit immaculate as always, but his collar slightly askew, something the methodical man she knew would never allow. "Sarah, I'm sorry, I've already eaten. The meeting with the investors ran late, and we ordered in." The lie rolled off his tongue so smoothly that Sarah might have believed it, if not for the faint trace of perfume clinging to his jacket, a scent she'd never worn. She nodded, maintaining her smile. "Of course, I understand. Oh, by the way, Emma called earlier. She's arriving tomorrow instead of next week. Something about wanting to spend more time with us before the family gathering." For a fraction of a second, James's composed facade cracked. His left eye twitched, a tell she'd learned to recognize during their countless poker nights with friends. "Emma. But she knows how busy I am with the merger right now. Your sister misses you, James, and honestly, I could use the company." Sarah turned back to the window, hiding the calculation in her eyes. Emma's early arrival hadn't been a spontaneous decision, Sarah had called her, voice trembling, after discovering the suspicious transfers from their joint account to an unknown offshore number. As James's footsteps retreated upstairs, Sarah pulled out her phone, checking the tracking app she'd installed on his car 2 weeks ago. The afternoon's location history showed not his office or any client location, but rather the Diamond Heights Hotel, the third such visit this month. Behind her, the security camera she'd secretly installed in the study blinked its tiny red light, recording James as he made another late-night phone call. Sarah's fingers curled into fists, her wedding ring catching the last rays of sunlight. The naive, trusting woman she'd been 6 months ago was gone, replaced by someone who understood that in this mansion of secrets, survival depended on staying one step ahead. Emma's arrival tomorrow would change everything. Sarah just hoped her sister-in-law was ready for the role she'd have to play in the dangerous game that their lives had become. The morning light filtered through the study's heavy curtains as Sarah methodically went through James's desk drawers. Her hands, steady despite her racing heart, carefully replaced each document exactly as she'd found it. 3 weeks of similar searches had taught her the importance of precision. James noticed even the slightest displacement of his belongings. A notification lit up her phone screen. James's car had just left Diamond Heights Hotel. Again. Sarah pulled up the surveillance footage from his study, recorded the previous night. The camera, disguised as a decorative paperweight, had been expensive but worth every penny. "I need more time," Victoria James's voice crackled through the recording. "The merger's falling apart, and if Sarah finds out about the company's debts." He paused, running fingers through his perfectly groomed hair. "No, you don't understand. Her inheritance is our only way out of this mess." Sarah's inheritance. The substantial trust fund her grandmother had left her, accessible only after her 5th wedding anniversary, or in the event of her death. The anniversary was still 8 months away. The sound of tires on gravel pulled Sarah from her thoughts. Through the window, she watched a taxi approach, carrying Emma's familiar figure. Sarah quickly closed the drawer and headed downstairs, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. She needed an ally, and her sister-in-law might be her only hope. Emma's warm embrace carried the scent of her signature jasmine perfume. At 32, Emma was the softer version of James' same dark hair and high cheekbones, but with genuine warmth in her eyes that her brothers had always lacked. "You look tired, sweetie. Is everything okay?" Before Sarah could respond, the sound of James's Mercedes interrupted them. He emerged from the car, his surprise at seeing Emma poorly concealed. "Sister dear, what a pleasant surprise. Though I wish you'd given us more notice." "Oh?" Sarah said she told you I was coming early. Emma's tone was light, but her eyes narrowed slightly. Years of sibling dynamics had taught her to read her brother's lies. That evening, after James retreated to his study with claims of urgent work, Sarah and Emma sat in the garden conservatory. The glass walls reflected their images against the darkness outside, making Sarah feel exposed. She lowered her voice anyway. "But I found something." Sarah's fingers trembled as she pulled out her phone, showing Emma the photos she'd taken of James's recent bank statements. "These transfers, they're draining our accounts, and there's more." She played the recording from James's study, watching Emma's face pale as her brother's voice discussed Sarah's inheritance with his mistress. Victoria Blake, Sarah explained. "His business partner. They've been meeting at Diamond Heights Hotel for months." The company's failing. Emma's whisper carried equal parts shock and resignation. "I should have known. Last month, he asked me to invest my savings in a guaranteed opportunity. When I refused, she trailed off, then squared her shoulders. "Sarah, there's something you should know about James's first girlfriend in college." As Emma spoke, pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. The mysterious accident that had left James's college girlfriend in a coma. The insurance policy he'd convinced her to sign just weeks before. The charges that were dropped due to lack of evidence. "I never had proof." Emma's voice cracked, but I knew what he'd done. "It's why I've never married." Watching him destroy someone he claimed to love, she gripped Sarah's hands. "We need to be careful. James doesn't just want your money, Sarah. He wants it all, and he won't let you walk away with anything." The grandfather clock in the hall chimed midnight, its sound echoing through the empty mansion. Sarah stared at their joined hands, her wedding ring catching the dim light. "But he's planning something, Emma. Yesterday I followed him to a specialty pharmacy in the city. He used a fake ID to purchase something, but I couldn't get close enough to see what." Emma's grip tightened. "The annual family gathering is in 3 days. All those witnesses, the perfect opportunity to stage an accident. Or to ensure there's someone to vouch for his devastation when tragedy strikes." Sarah's voice was steel. "But he doesn't know that we know, and for now that's our only advantage." But in his study, James smiled at his computer screen, confirming his latest purchase, a rare, untraceable poison that would mimic the symptoms of a severe allergic reaction. As he closed the browser, a reflection in the window caught his attention. Movement in the garden conservatory. But when he turned to look, all he saw was darkness and the silent watching of the estate's ancient trees. The next morning, Sarah waited until James left for his emergency meeting before slipping into his study. Her hands, steady from years of surgical practice, carefully lifted the false bottom of his desk drawer, a hiding place she'd discovered by accident while cleaning last week. Inside lay a small paper bag from Carlton's specialty pharmacy, containing a receipt for something called aconite extract. As she Googled the substance on her phone, her blood ran cold. Aconite, a potent poison, often called the queen of poisons, known for being nearly untraceable after death. Her medical training kicked in, recalling case studies of aconite poisoning mimicking heart attacks and allergic reactions. The sound of her own wedding video playing from James's laptop startled her. He must have been watching it earlier. On screen, a younger Sarah beamed at the camera, her white dress catching the summer light. "I just know we'll be together forever," her past self declared, while James gazed at her adoringly. 5 years earlier. "You look absolutely radiant," James had whispered during their first dance. The garden reception sparkled with fairy lights, and Sarah felt like she was living a fairy tale. James's business was taking off. They'd just bought their dream house, and her grandmother had blessed their union with the promise of a generous inheritance upon their 5th anniversary. "I can't believe how lucky I am," Sarah had replied, nestling into his arms. James's sister Emma watched from the sidelines, her champagne glass gripped too tightly, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. Present day. "He was different back then," Sarah murmured, closing the video. "But was he really?" Or had she simply been too blinded by love to see the truth? A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Emma stood in the doorway, her face grim. "I found something you need to see." She held out a worn diary, its pages yellow with age. "This was our mother's. I've been keeping it safe since she passed." They moved to the garden conservatory, their unofficial sanctuary. As Sarah read, Emma paced, her words spilling out like a long-held confession. James was always different. When he was 12, he convinced our younger cousin Tommy that his new puppy had run away. For weeks, Tommy was devastated. Then we found the collar buried in James's closet. He'd given the puppy to a friend, just because Tommy had gotten more attention at Christmas. Sarah's hands trembled as she turned the diary's pages, reading accounts of James's escalating manipulation through his teenage years, money disappearing, girlfriends who mysteriously withdrew from school, business partners who suddenly signed over their shares. "Our mother knew," Emma continued, her voice breaking. "She tried to get him help, but he was too clever, always had an explanation, always made her doubt herself. The gaslighting drove her to anxiety medication. When she died," Emma paused, collecting herself. "The doctors called it an accidental overdose. But she'd been keeping careful track of her pills in this diary. The numbers didn't add up." Sarah felt the weight of her wedding ring like a burning brand. "I remember our first year together. Every time I questioned anything, he had such reasonable explanations. The late nights were for our future. The secret phone calls were surprise party planning. The missing money was a temporary investment." Her mind raced to the upcoming family gathering. 30 guests. The perfect cover for an accidental poisoning. She could picture it now, James's perfectly practiced grief, the shocked guests serving as witnesses to his devastation, the inevitable investigation finding nothing suspicious about a tragic allergic reaction. The next 2 days passed in a blur of preparation. James insisted on handling all the dinner arrangements himself, unusual for a man who'd never shown interest in party planning before. Sarah watched him make calls to the catering company, noting how he specifically requested that the pre-dinner drinks be served in the antique crystal glasses that had belonged to her grandmother. "Such a shame you're allergic to shellfish," he commented casually over breakfast. "The caterers are preparing the most amazing seafood bisque as a starter." Sarah caught Emma's eye across the table. They both knew Sarah had no such allergy. It was James building his cover story, piece by calculated piece. The day before the gathering, Sarah stood in their bedroom, staring at their wedding photo. The happy couple smiled back at her, frozen in time. She touched her younger self's face through the glass, wondering how that bright-eyed bride had become a woman plotting to survive her own husband's murderous intentions. Emma found her there, still staring at the photo. "The guests start arriving tomorrow afternoon," she said softly. "James has been in his study all morning, finalizing the seating arrangements." Sarah nodded, her decision crystallizing. "The crystal glasses were my grandmother's wedding gift to us," she said quietly. "She always insisted we use them for special occasions, said they were meant to bring good fortune to true love." Emma's voice held a warning. "Did you know that crystal has a distinct ring when you tap it?" Sarah continued, her voice distant. "Each glass sounds slightly different, like fingerprints made of sound." Understanding dawned in Emma's eyes. "The drinks will be served before dinner, during the family mingling time. James always insisted I take the glass he hands me personally." His little display of chivalry, Sarah's lips curved in a smile that held no warmth. Such a thoughtful husband. Outside, the catering vans began arriving, and James's voice drifted up from the driveway, directing them with unusual enthusiasm. Tomorrow, the mansion would be full of family, laughter, and celebration. And somewhere among the crystal glasses, death would wait like a spider in its web. Sarah squared her shoulders, doctor's instincts warring with 5 years of love and betrayal. "We have until tomorrow evening to ensure his plan backfires. Are you ready?" Emma's answer was to pull her sister-in-law into a fierce embrace. In the garden below, James continued his preparations, unaware that his carefully orchestrated performance was about to take an unexpected turn. The mansion hummed with the warmth of 30 guests, their laughter echoing through the high-ceilinged rooms. Crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over the gathering, while staff in black and white weaved through the crowd with trays of appetizers. Sarah stood at the foot of the grand staircase, the perfect picture of a gracious hostess in her emerald silk dress, watching her husband work the room. James was in his element, charm radiating from him like heat from a fire. "Sarah, darling," he called out, making his way toward her with 2 crystal glasses in hand. "I've been keeping these safe for us. Grandmother's special glasses for a special occasion." Sarah's heart thundered in her chest as she watched him approach. Earlier, she'd seen him slip into the study alone with the drinks tray, emerging minutes later with that same practiced smile. The security camera would have caught whatever he did, but there was no time to check now. "You're too good to me," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. As she reached for the glass he offered, she noticed something only a wife of 5 years would catch: the slight tension around his eyes, the barely perceptible tremor in his left hand. "A toast," James announced, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "To family gatherings and new beginnings." But our eyes met over the rims of their glasses. In that moment, Sarah saw something flicker in his gaze: anticipation, regret. Or was it simply the reflection of her own fear? Emma's voice cut through the tension. She appeared at their side, slightly breathless. "The caterers need your input on the wine pairing. Something about the vintage you specifically requested." Now James's irritation showed for a split second before his smooth mask slipped back into place. "Surely they can." "They're quite insistent," Emma pressed. "You know how particular you are about your wines." Sarah watched the internal battle play out on her husband's face, stay and ensure she drank from the correct glass, or maintain his persona of the perfect host. Social appearance won out. "Don't drink without me, darling," he said to Sarah, his tone light but eyes intense. "I'll be right back." The moment he turned away, Sarah's fingers flew into action. The crystal glasses chimed softly as she switched them, muscle memory from years of surgical precision guiding her movements. Emma positioned herself to block the view from any curious onlookers. Emma's whisper was tense. "Are you sure about this?" Before Sarah could respond, the crowd's murmur shifted. James was returning, his stride purposeful. Emma, acting on instinct, reached for the glass in Sarah's hand, the one James had originally intended for his wife. "I can't wait any longer," Emma declared loudly, playing the role of the slightly tipsy sister. "Whatever vintage James selected, I'm sure it's perfect." She raised the glass to her lips. "Emma, wait." James's protest came too late. His sister had already taken a long sip. Sarah watched her husband's face drain of color. For the first time in their marriage, she saw raw panic break through his controlled facade. The next few minutes unfolded like a scene from a nightmare. Emma's glass slipped from her fingers, shattering on the marble floor. She clutched her throat, gasping. The perfect orchestration of the evening dissolved into chaos. "She's having an allergic reaction," James shouted, his voice cracking. "Someone call an ambulance." Sarah rushed to Emma's side, medical training taking over. "Stay with me, Emma," she commanded, checking vital signs even as she heard guests scrambling for phones. Emma's pulse raced under her fingers, skin clammy. Through it all, Sarah felt James hovering, his presence electric with barely contained panic. He knew the ambulance would come too late. The poison had been meant for her, calculated, untraceable, the perfect crime. Instead, he'd just poisoned his own sister in front of 30 witnesses. Sarah's voice cut through the chaos. "Your study? You have a new EpiPen in there, don't you? The one you insisted on getting last week for my shellfish allergy." Their eyes met across Emma's convulsing form. They both knew there was no EpiPen, just like they both knew there was no shellfish allergy. But now James had to make a show of running to look for it, had to maintain his role as the concerned brother, even as his carefully laid plans crumbled around him. As he sprinted toward the study, Sarah pulled the real antidote from her clutch acquired through her hospital contacts after identifying the poison. Emma's fingers squeezed her hand weakly as she administered it, their staged performance having bought them the precious minutes they needed. The sound of approaching sirens filled the air. Soon, the mansion would be swarming with paramedics and, inevitably, police. Sarah held her sister-in-law's hand, feeling the pulse gradually stabilize, and waited for the sounds of James discovering that his study had been thoroughly documented by hidden cameras just in time to catch him planting his sister's emergency EpiPen. "Stay with me," she whispered again to Emma, but this time there was no fear in her voice. Only the grim satisfaction of a trap well sprung. The mansion's elegant facade crumbled into chaos as emergency vehicles flooded the circular driveway, their red and blue lights painting violent shadows across manicured lawns. Inside, paramedics swarmed around Emma's prone form while guests huddled in corners, their evening finery now incongruously bright against the gravity of the moment. BPs dropping, pulse irregular. One paramedic called out, "We need to move her now." But James paced nearby, his designer suit disheveled, the perfect host persona fracturing with each passing moment. "I don't understand," he kept muttering. "The EpiPen, I could have sworn." Sarah stood to the side, playing her role perfectly, the concerned sister-in-law, the capable doctor, the worried wife, but her eyes never left James, watching him unravel thread by thread. The antidote she'd administered was working. Emma's color was improving, though she remained unconscious. Detective Lisa Chen arrived as the paramedics were loading Emma into the ambulance. Her sharp eyes took in the scene: the shattered crystal on the floor, the disturbed dinner setting, the shell-shocked guests. "Mrs. Walker," she approached Sarah. "I understand you're a doctor. Can you walk me through what happened?" Before Sarah could respond, James interjected, his voice pitched slightly too high. It must have been an allergic reaction. "Sarah has a shellfish allergy, and we were serving seafood tonight. Emma must have accidentally taken her glass." "Interesting theory," Detective Chen said mildly, "considering Mrs. Walker's medical records show no history of shellfish allergies." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah watched her husband's face as the implications sank in. "I have something you need to see," Sarah said quietly, leading the detective toward James's study. "And James, you should join us." The study looked exactly as it had that morning: leather-bound books lining the walls, the antique desk dominating the space. But now Sarah's phone displayed a series of damning videos: James adding clear liquid to a crystal glass, his furtive movements as he marked it with a nearly invisible scratch to identify it later. "We also have these," Sarah continued, laying out bank statements showing massive transfers, the receipt for the aconite purchase, and finally the diary entries from James's mother. James lunged for the papers, but two officers blocked his path. His composure shattered completely. "You were supposed to drink it," he snarled at Sarah. "It was meant for you. Do you know what you've done? The company's failing. The investors are pulling out. Your inheritance was our only hope." "No," James. Sarah's voice was steel. "It was your only hope. The company's been failing for years, ever since you started embezzling from it to fund your affair with Victoria Blake." The name hit him like a physical blow. Detective Chen's eyebrows rose as she made notes. "Miss Blake has been very cooperative," the detective added. "She turned over quite a collection of interesting texts and emails this afternoon." At the hospital, Emma regained consciousness under the harsh fluorescent lights. Sarah sat beside her bed, both women exhausted but triumphant. The antidote had worked perfectly as they'd known it would, having planned this outcome meticulously. "He's confessed to everything," Sarah told her sister-in-law. "The poison, the company fraud, even his involvement in the accident with his college girlfriend. Once he started talking, he couldn't stop." Emma managed a weak smile. "It was worth it then. Though I have to say, being poisoned wasn't quite as much fun as we made it look in rehearsal." Sarah squeezed her hand. "Your performance was Oscar-worthy. The doctors say you'll make a full recovery. We administered the antidote well within the safety window." And Victoria turned state's evidence the moment we presented her with proof of James's other crimes. Apparently, she didn't appreciate discovering she wasn't the only one he was planning to betray. Outside Emma's hospital room, reporters gathered like vultures, eager to document the downfall of prominent businessman James Walker. The story had everything: attempted murder, corporate fraud, betrayal at the highest levels of society. But they would never know the full truth: how two women had orchestrated the perfect trap, using James's own murderous intentions against him. Detective Chen's final interview with Sarah painted the official picture: a suspicious wife discovers her husband's plot, documents everything, and happens to save her sister-in-law from becoming an accidental victim. No one needed to know about the weeks of planning, the carefully staged reactions, the deliberate swap that ensured Emma received a carefully diluted dose of poison along with the prepared antidote. As Sarah left the hospital that night, her phone buzzed with a text from her lawyer. The divorce papers were ready. James's confession had ensured she'd retain everything: the house, her inheritance, and most importantly, her freedom. The company's legitimate assets would go to repaying the investors he'd defrauded, while James himself faced decades in prison. She paused in the parking lot, looking up at the stars visible through the city's light pollution. Somewhere in the county jail, James sat in a cell, his perfect life in ruins, destroyed not by the poison he'd intended for his wife, but by the trust he'd shattered long ago. 1 year later. The courtroom fell silent as the judge delivered the sentence. James Walker, once the pinnacle of social and business success, stood motionless as his fate was sealed. 25 years for attempted murder, with additional sentences for fraud and embezzlement to run concurrently. Sarah watched from the gallery, Emma's hand clasped tightly in hers, as the man she'd once loved was led away in handcuffs. "Please understand," he'd written in his final letter from jail, "everything I did was for us." Sarah had burned the letter without finishing it. Some lies didn't deserve to be heard. The healing process hadn't been easy. For months after James's arrest, Sarah would wake in cold sweats, remembering the moment she realized her husband had meant to kill her. The massive house, once a symbol of their perfect life, felt haunted by memories of betrayal. But she refused to let James take anything more from her. Instead, she transformed the space. The study where he'd plotted her death became a home office where she managed her grandmother's charitable foundation. The formal dining room, scene of that fateful dinner, was renovated into a warm gathering space where she and Emma hosted weekly dinners for domestic violence survivors. "You know what's ironic?" Emma said one evening, as they sat in the garden conservatory that had witnessed their early conspiracies. "He always thought he was the clever one, the puppet master pulling everyone's strings. Never occurred to him that the women in his life might be stronger than he imagined." Sarah smiled, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of hope. Strength was never about being clever enough to poison someone. It was about being brave enough to trust again. That trust had come in unexpected ways. The community, rather than shunning them after the scandal, had rallied around the two women. James's former business partners, themselves victims of his fraudulent schemes, helped Sarah establish a foundation supporting financial literacy for women leaving abusive relationships. Even Victoria Blake, after serving her reduced sentence for cooperation, had become an advocate for corporate transparency. "Sometimes I wonder," Sarah mused, "if he ever truly understood what he had. The money, the status, the family, none of it was enough, because he couldn't control it all." Emma nodded, understanding flowing between them like an invisible current. Their bond, forged in the fire of shared trauma, had emerged stronger than any family tie James had ever honored. They were sisters now in truth, not just in law. The media had eventually moved on to newer scandals, but the ripples of their story continued to spread. Women would approach them in restaurants or write letters, sharing their own stories of survival. Each one reinforced what Sarah had learned in that crucial moment of switching the glasses. Sometimes saving yourself meant being willing to shatter the beautiful illusions that kept you trapped. Sarah's grandmother's crystal glasses, what remained of them, now sat in a display case in the living room. A reminder, she would tell visitors, that appearances could be deceiving. The most dangerous poison wasn't in any glass, it was in believing that love could coexist with control. As the sun set on another day in the mansion, Sarah walked through rooms that no longer felt like a gilded cage. The security cameras remained, but now they represented protection rather than surveillance. The isolation that had once felt suffocating had become peaceful. She was no longer the naive bride who had walked these halls 5 years ago, nor the frightened wife who had discovered her husband's plot. She was something else entirely: a survivor, a mentor, a phoenix risen from the ashes of betrayal. To new beginnings she and Emma would toast each evening, their glasses filled with nothing more dangerous than friendship and truth. The perfect ending, they had learned, wasn't about revenge or justice. It was about reclaiming their own story, one day at a time. And somewhere in a prison cell, James Walker would receive periodic updates about his ex-wife's flourishing new life, each success a reminder that some poisons, like his own bitterness and greed, only destroyed the vessel that carried them.